Here, okay, perfect. Oh, do I need to turn this on? Worked a minute ago. So while we're figuring that out, I guess I'll give a little bit more of an introduction of the type of translation work that I've done, and the way that that will inform the conversation that we're going to have today. So I've worked mostly as a translator and interpreter. Thanks. In this works now? Yep. Okay. In medical contexts with English and Spanish, but in other contexts I've worked as well, some to a much lesser degree with French and ASL. And so as we go through the conversation, we'll have a little bit of anecdotal information. A lot of it is going to be based on my experience in the context of a larger conversation. So feel free as well throughout this, if you have questions that pop up in the middle, or if there's something that you want clarified, please don't hesitate. I like to think of myself as a little bit informal, even though this feels very, very formal at the moment. So there we go. Okay, so let's start by looking at somebody next to you and asking the first two questions here. What is translation and what makes for a good translation? Let's see if you can just take a minute to agree on some kind of a definition for translation. Oh, yeah, online that's going to be a lot harder. That's true. Okay, so look to the person on the other side of you. If you're online, grab a mirror or your phone. And ask what is interpreting and what makes for a good interpretation. And maybe this is something different. Maybe the definition that you come to is the same, but I'm curious to hear.
No.
So I guess depending on the situation,
All right, so let's see. Who wants to share? What is translation? Who has an idea? Let's see, somebody on this side of the room has an idea of what translation is. It's okay if you're not sure, but I want to hear, a rough draft.
Taking something someone said in one language and putting it into another.
Okay, perfect. All right. What makes for a good translation? Somebody from this side. Please.
Accurate to what the person says and what they mean.
Okay, accurate to what someone says and what they mean. Great. How is interpreting different to those of you in the middle? Please.
I think that interpreting is different because when it comes to translation, it is like word for word, but when it comes to interpreting, it not only takes the verbal, but it also takes the body.
Okay, so for the, I'm just going to try to recap. So it includes, so interpreting is in some ways very similar, but translation is word for word, and interpreting takes in other pieces like body language and other visual cues. Okay, great. So the purpose of this was to figure out what everybody generally believes about this. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of talk you through the definitions that we're going to be using for this conversation. Okay, so translation is typically understood as a transfer of language through a written medium from one language to another. So if you take a newspaper article in French and you turn it into a newspaper article in Japanese, that newspaper article has been translated. Interpreting is generally understood as a live action, in real time conversational transfer of information from one language into another. So if John here decides to start speaking to somebody, saying what I'm saying in Spanish to somebody on the other side of the room, that would be interpreting. It's simultaneous. And so that's just an important context to have as we go into the conversation. And I think what's really interesting, and we're going to talk about it a lot, is this idea about faithfulness, accuracy, true to what was said and true to what was meant. And I think we need to hang on to that as understanding that that's what society and all of us as part of society, that's our starting point when we talk about translating and interpreting. And what I want to bring to the conversation today is that that shouldn't be our ending point, okay? We want to have a much more dynamic understanding when we're talking about medical and social services than that definition, okay? So let's have some background. Translating and interpreting has existed for thousands of years. Globalization is not new. The way that we understand it is different, but there has been trade, there have been international agreements, there has been biblical translation for thousands of years. But when we're looking at it today in this context, we understand the modern discipline of translation and interpreting a little bit more narrow. So it's typically understood as an international or interregional flow of information. So this is could be within Spain, for example, between Catalan and Castilian speaking communities. But it could also be between Spain and France, or between the United States and Mexico. This is what generally translation is understood as in when we talk about translation studies. So some examples are international laws and treaties. If we picture for a moment the United Nations, right? They are navigating treaties, they are creating new laws, and that's happening in multiple languages at the same time. Those are translated in the written form and interpreted in the live action navigation of, I guess, the discussion, the agreements. We think about immigration and customs. We think about marketing and product sales, media distribution. If you've watched Korean shows on Netflix recently, right? That's all part of that translation experience. And there is a presumption in this model that translating and interpreting facilitates communication between peers. So again, if we imagine the United Nations model, those are diplomats from country A speaking to diplomats from country B. And it's important to think about those, that they have the same background information as each other. They have very similar education profiles. They come from very similar socioeconomic backgrounds. And that is kind of what leads us to the assumption that we can translate something with the same tone and with the same meaning. But let's look at the way language is used in the US and sort of start to question whether this is really the best model to think about translating and interpreting domestically. So in the US, translating and interpreting is not an international phenomenon. It is a domestic phenomenon. And I'm going to leave Puerto Rico as a separate, very complex conversation to have at a different time, because I'm really much more focusing on recent immigrants in the US, and Puerto Rico kind of throws a lot of different realities into the conversation that I think would take it beyond what's useful at this moment. The educational structure in the United States, in the vast majority of cases, requires and mandates mastery of English. So because of that, there is a power differential that is created between people who speak English and people who don't speak English in the United States. Now, I am by no means suggesting that that is acceptable, nor that we should just take that at face value, but that is the reality, is that there are certain stigmas associated with not speaking English. And those are frequently, correctly or incorrectly, at an individual level, often based on the societal expectation that if you are educated, you speak English. And that's the way that our society is built, okay? So if that's the way our society is built, what do we assume about people? If we think that educated people speak English, what do we think about people who don't? Please.
That they're uneducated?
Yeah, that's a logical, and I'm not saying that we should. I am saying that this is kind of the situation as the lay of the land, as it were. Anybody else want to add anything to that? Please.
Or like even if they may be educated, they are in pedestal.
Yes, so even, again, yeah, I'm gonna repeat it for the microphone here. So even those who are educated, they're secondary. They're in you used a hand motion to indicate you said a different pedestal, but your hand very much indicated a lower status, right? Pass my water, please. I have managed to leave it over there. Great. So this is the language realities in the US. So now the question is, how does that play into translating and interpreting? Great. Oh, perfect. Okay. So there are a few different realities. If we go back to what I said about the expectation is a conversation between peers, and this is the way that translating and interpreting has been understood as a field. The reality is sometimes there are educational differences between speakers in a domestic translation or interpreting interaction. Sometimes that is because there is in fact an education difference, right? Objectively, if we're talking about medical and social services, that could be doctors, nurses, lawyers, refugee boards, organizations like this, social workers, right? Who are very well versed and understand their fields. The people with whom they may be having these linguistic interactions, and on both ends of this, these are clients. I'll refer to them both in both directions as clients. They may not understand medicine, law, et cetera, right? So there could be a difference in education. And the perception of the relationship between a language professional, a translator or an interpreter, and structures of the state. So let's metaphorically close our eyes. Please don't actually close your eyes because that's going to be weird. But metaphorically close our eyes and imagine for a second the reality of a refugee seeker. Okay, they have left their home because the mechanisms of the state that are meant to protect them, the police force, the military, the legal structures, did not protect them. Okay, they had to flee their home. And they're sitting in front of someone who they know speaks a language that they do not know, and is going to take their words and change them into someone else's words. And that person is being paid by the state. Think about the dynamic and the relationship of trust when your only experience with the state has caused you to leave everything behind to go to a different country so that you can survive. So the very idea of how the model works already predisposes certain clients to a distrust, right? And that can affect the way that we're working. Another point that is important to make is training disparities. For all of the careers that I mentioned, social work, law, nursing, doctors, etc., those people all have exams to pass. There are licensing boards. There are no licensing boards for translators and interpreters in the United States. There is no unified standard, and most of the training programs focus on what I said at the beginning, the international relationship of conversation between peers. So because there is no requirement to be certified, and even where there are programs, they often aren't focusing on a domestic US at-home situation, we've got a bit of a tension, right? We have people going into situations that they're not quite sure how to navigate. And the last is a misunderstanding of translating and interpreting by medical and social service professionals. So what I want to say is when you bring a translator and interpreter into a room, it is because both sides of the relationship are unable to communicate. I think it's very easy for us to think, oh, the non-English speaker needs the translator or interpreter. Well, in fact, so does the English speaker, right? Because they are both equal parties to this dynamic. And frequently, medical and social service professionals don't understand how translation interpreting needs to work. They have watched The Interpreter. Nicole Kidman was great, loved the movie, not helpful, right? And so they've created this idea of how it should work in their sort of imagination, but the level of actual skill that most of the medical and social service professionals have working with a translator or interpreter is very little. And so let's look at what I would like to say. I realize this is probably rather small text for those of you in the back. What I think, instead of the model that we've that we started with, saying that it needs to be translated as accurately with the same tone, meaning the same thing in the same words, word for word, all of those, I would like to propose that we aim for something different. So I'm going to talk about two words. One is agency. So agency is the ability of someone to make their own free choices, unimpeded by external forces. Now, no one is ever completely unimpeded by external forces, but the idea here is that you have the tools and the knowledge and the skills and the freedom to make your own decisions, right? And the second is taken from, is part of a definition that is provided by the American Medical Association. The definition is much longer, but I have truncated it just for the purposes of this conversation. And this is informed consent. So the process of informed consent, the AMA says, occurs when communication between a patient and physician results in the patient's authorization or agreement to undergo a specific medical intervention. In seeking a patient's informed consent, or the consent of the patient surrogate if the patient lacks decision-making capacity or declines to participate in making decisions, physicians should A, assess the patient's ability to understand relevant medical information and the implications of treatment alternatives and to make an independent, voluntary decision. Okay, so what is that? What are some challenges in this linguistic exchange when we're talking about agency and informed consent? I think that the purpose of the translator and interpreter should be to ensure that the clients have enough information, both clients, to ensure that any decision made is made understanding the proper outcomes, the risks involved, the treatment process, etc. So let's look at social determinants of agency in community and medical context. So one is health literacy. Let's see, how many of you, when you go to the doctor, understand 100% about the treatment process the first time it's told to you by the doctor? So you go in and you say, I don't know what this is, I have a strange rash, and the doctor says, and you say, okay, perfect. And you walk out fully convinced that you know exactly what's happening to your body and what you need to do to fix it. No, right, okay. And the same cannot be expected of people with a language gap in between, right? How many of you feel comfortable asking questions generally of your doctor? Right? Hands? Great, great, okay. So also not everyone, right? Now imagine again that relationship with the interpreter that you're not sure, can I trust this person? Who is this person? Am I allowed to ask questions? Okay, I'm gonna give a couple examples here. One is, I worked with a deaf woman. I was not functioning as interpreter in this role, but I would visit her and help her do her groceries and things like this. And I visited with her for a long time, maybe a year or something. And at one point we're in the grocery store and I said something, I don't even remember what it was, but the outcome was, oh, I'm not allowed to eat cake or juice. And I thought, well, that's a bizarre combination. Who eats cake with juice, right? And so as I'm thinking about it, having worked as a medical interpreter, I thought, I bet this woman has diabetes and doesn't know, right? Like what is common between these things? So the next time her social worker contacted me, I said, I think this woman probably needs some clarification. Because I asked her, I said, well, why cake and juice? And she said, oh, I don't know. And she would proceed to buy ice cream, right? So the question is this person in fact able to does she have agency in this experience? Does she understand? Now, that doesn't mean that there was not an interpreter there telling her. There was. But they were telling her that she couldn't have cake and juice, right? So there's a gap with the health literacy. And there was a perception that because she felt uneducated in front of the doctor compared to the doctor, she didn't want to ask questions lest the doctor think that she was uneducated and so it was a lack of ability to advocate for herself. Okay, so that's one example. Another is when I was an interpreter, a medical interpreter, a woman came in who was having eye problems. And she said to the doctor, I'm having these, I've never been to the doctor before, she said. She was 80. Okay? She says, but I'm having vision problems. So the doctor ordered a blood test. Now I want you to imagine for a second, you've never been to a doctor. You have no idea that a leading cause of vision problems in somebody of that age could be diabetes. Again, you've never been. And they want to poke something in your arm when you're having problems with your eyes. There's no logical connection if you don't have that health literacy, right? Another problem is health access. Not everyone can pay or knows how to pay or knows where to go or knows the basic level of how to get to that medical service, okay? We're going to go on to the next point though, which is societal and civic literacy, particularly in communities where a large portion of the adult population doesn't speak the dominant language. So for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to say Spanish. They tend to also socialize with other people who speak their language. This is logic, right? Like, why would you go socialize with a whole bunch of people who speak a language that you don't speak? And there develops a sort of informal networks of information sharing that are not always the most accurate. So people say, oh yeah, when I came here, this was how things were. And that then passes on to someone else. And we've all played telephone, and you know that at the end of 7 or 8 friends, you have a totally different message, right? So urban legends and sort of this mythical, invented sort of information sharing becomes the main form of getting access to social and civic information. And that also impedes people's ability to actually access the things that they need to do. They hear, oh, so-and-so, such and so happened at school and they took so-and-so's kids away and we don't know what happened to them, right? And it's this level of not always being able to access enough of the information to make your own decisions about the process because the information is not available in a language that you can digest. The last point I want to talk about is documentation status. So we know that people who are undocumented may be, or have undocumented people living in their homes, may be less likely to seek out resources that could be very beneficial to them because they're not sure how, even for documented people living with them, because they're not quite sure how the effect that will have on their own stability. Okay. So what I want to talk about now is, so now that we have this whole image, right? We have this image of what translating and interpreting is in a global context, what the actual language issues are in the United States and the way that we navigate these situations. What do we do about it, right? It's not enough to just take the words and spit them out if somebody's takeaway is that cake and juice are off limits, but bring on the ice cream. Right? There's got to be a better option than quote unquote accuracy, okay? So what I would say is first and foremost, you need to be, if you are a translator, excuse me, or interpreter, you need to be embedded in the communities for which you are interpreting. This seems obvious, okay, but it's not. The number of American Sign Language interpreters, for example, who don't socialize with deaf people is shocking. If you don't socialize, you don't know what the community concerns are. You are simply parroting information without the proper cultural context. The number of Spanish interpreters in community settings that don't socialize with Spanish speakers who don't frequently use English is also shocking, right? Part of it might be, who are your peers? Who are you going to come in contact with? If you're bilingual, you might not come in contact as much with people who are not bilingual. But you need to, like, get out of your shell a little bit, right? If you're working for this community, you need to be able to understand what the community's concerns are, who the community is made up of. And that can't happen when you're sitting there helping them make sometimes very awkward health decisions. The amount of weird health things that I've encountered is rather shocking, considering that I never wanted to work in a doctor's office. It just happened one day, and I could do the job and I was prepared to do the job, but I didn't go in thinking that I was going to have to be dealing with bodily fluids. It's weird, right? So you can't get to know a community member in those moments. Another is to seek active participation and feedback from clients, from both sides of the experience. Most people, we'll talk about this in the last point, but most people have this impression that they're going to go about their day like normal, and you're going to talk, and then it just otherwise is normal. There's just an extra person in the room, and that's not the reality, right? Just because somebody says yes does not mean that they have the information required to get and make informed consent. So the question needs to be, this is what the doctor has said. Do you have any questions? No, you don't have any questions. Tell me again what needs to happen. Right now, I'm not saying that, obviously, do not baby people. That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I'm saying is that part of the struggle in an interpreting situation is that if we imagine ourselves again in a doctor's office, there are pragmatic types of conversation markers that indicate if someone's following or not, right? So I see you're nodding your head over here. I presume that probably means that you are following and agreeing, right? If somebody's furrowing their brow like this, it indicates that maybe they're not quite sure, at least in our sort of North American society, right? And when you're in a doctor's office and you're having a conversation in the same language, the doctors can gauge when you are making those expressions and can backtrack and can fill in some gaps. When there is a language delay, they can't tell when the confusion is happening, right? So as a translator and interpreter, part of it is your job to also be able to say, I've conveyed the message, but they seem unsure about X point. And this is where we have to get rid of this idea of, saying only exactly what was said, right? Because this is not a peer-to-peer relationship in the same way. Another is to be willing to shift registers as needed. Does anybody know what a language register is? Right, informality. So the way I'm talking to you is I'm not the same as the way that I talk to my friends, right? So that's the difference in registers, that this is a more formal register, friends would be more casual, etc. And this can be uncomfortable. Okay, I'm gonna give you a really awkward example because why not? So imagine again this scenario with this 80-year-old woman or other people who have not been to the doctor's office very much in their life. Now, in the same language, if you have never been to the doctor's office before, and we're not even talking about translation, and this is based on an actual experience that I've had, I'm not just making ridiculous examples. Is it immediately evident what a stool sample is? So how do you gain that without using a medical register? You still need that in the cup. Using a medical register, it's really nice and feels very professional and very distant from what you're talking about. But if you're not getting it in the cup, the mission has not been accomplished, okay? And the ability to have a conversation and say, ma'am, you need to poop in the cup. Okay, it's uncomfortable, right? Because we have learned that professionalism in a North American context is cold and scientific. But that's not getting the message across. And to some degree, that falls on the interpreter to say, goal is the message. I tried to say it in a fancy way, didn't work. Let's try again, right? Explain background information as required, but be transparent. This is a lot easier to do when you've worked with the same person or the same provider, a medical provider, social service provider, more than once. As you start to understand, oh, when X happens, the provider is going to suggest Y, right? You can provide that information in advance and say, the doctor, I hear what you've said. This is what the doctor has said, and the doctor is going to ask for. But be transparent about it. Say, I'm going to let them know where this is going based on what you've done in the past. Let both parties know there should be no conversation that is hidden from the other parties, but recognizing that sometimes there needs to be more information is a very valuable observation, I guess, or practice as you translate or interpret in these contexts. Clarifying the process and norms of working with translators and interpreters to all clients. Before you start, you can sit down and say, listen, this is how I'm going to work. I am going to observe things, and the person may not ask a question, but I'm going to tell you that they seem unsure. Tell the other person, I'm going to tell the doctor that you seem uncertain if I see that you look confused, right? Be transparent about it. No one wants to feel like a conversation is happening without them, especially when what I'm suggesting is to increase informed consent and increase agency. But the simple kind of cold parroting model that we like to think of as translating and interpreting is insufficient in these contexts. So be transparent, let people know how you're going to work in advance so that when it comes up, it's not shocking to anyone, okay? And I think we all have an obligation to work to raise capacity of medical and social service professionals when it comes to language services. So again, there is no uniform body that regulates translators and interpreters. So oftentimes a lot of people think that, oh, I can just grab Juan over here. Juan's mom is from Mexico. Like, I'm sure he can do the job. Well, no, that's not what translating and interpreting is, right? It is a level of awareness of yourself and of the language that is not afforded to every single person who has bilingual capacity. Many times we don't think about why we say things the way that we say them in our native language. But you have to think about that not only in your native language, but also in the second language that you're working with. in a constant and ongoing way. It's not something that we just grab someone and bring them in. So working to raise the capacity by saying, these are what you should be expecting of the quality, the training of the people working for you. This is how you, as a monolingual service provider, can gauge the effectiveness of the language professional that you're working with, right? They have no idea. If they only speak one language, you could be reading Don Quixote. They would have no clue what you're talking about. But yet somehow, so often, these professionals who have come through a very high level of education believe that they are in some sort of a decision-making capacity and that everything else kind of cascades down from there. And that's the model that they work under, right? But the problem is just because they have said something does not mean that that something has been communicated. And they fail to understand that very often unless they have worked in these situations frequently. The other thing that I will say is not on the PowerPoint, but I was thinking about it on the drive over, is that it's also, there is a significant burden of decision-making process on the language professional themselves. They need to make sure that they're capable of doing justice by this assignment, right? If you cannot have a conversation about child abuse because of your own trauma, you need to recuse yourself. You cannot project your own trauma onto a situation. Likewise, if you don't have the vocabulary or perhaps the emotional availability to have a conversation about cancer treatments, you probably need to recuse yourself from those opportunities. And that's very difficult to do, but really, there's a lot of potential harm that can come from making decisions about things when you're not sure if you understand them to begin with. So with all of that, I want to say that I think that moving away from this model of translation as perfection, translation as the same as the original, I think, great for the United Nations. But for the local communities that are around us, what we need is for people to come away understanding fundamentally that the decisions that they are making will have consequences, that they are okay with the consequences of those decisions, and that they understand how to minimize any long-term effects of whatever treatment it is, based on the information that has been accurately transmitted to them, filling in the gaps as needed, et cetera, not simply feeling intimidated because the language used was not something that they felt that they could kind of digest or that they could participate in. So I will leave it there for now. I hope you all have enjoyed. Nobody's sleeping, so that's a great sign. And I would love to hear any questions that you have. Thank you all so much. Oh yeah, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Remy. But for those who has a question, please ask, and for audience via Zoom, please send your question via QA, so I will ask the question for you. Okay, so the open of QA starts. So, yeah, go ahead.
Please.
So I have a question about, you said that you don't need any like certificate or requirements to actually work in a hospital as interpreter, and then you kind of jumped in and you didn't want to. So are there like any requirements, or how can you actually start?
It's a hot mess is the quick answer for you. So basically, there are no, so when I did this was 20 years ago. Gosh, it's 20 years ago. So things have changed a little bit, but there were very few training programs at all 20 years ago. And right now, there's just a general misconception of, some people will say, oh, we need to certify, but then nobody certifies, right? So like people are asking for things that don't exist, and they think that they need things, but then there's no agencies to provide them. So there are for certain things, for legal, some states have a testing process. And that's up to the state usually. I think that for federal courts, there is a federal process, but that is not then recognized in individual states. The medical situation is there are boards, but there's no requirement. And that's where it gets very messy is you can take these tests. But a lot of people say, but what's the benefit to me? Right? Like, sure, I get approved, but I was working without being approved. And doctors don't know what to ask for. So it's a really messy. There are ways to do it. There are ways to invest time and energy in learning to do it properly. But there's not currently an expectation that you meet those before providing service.
So
And
you just kind of jump in.
a lot of people do. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question from the audience. Via Zoom, great presentation, Dr. Attig. What are a few things that hospitals can do to make health literacy access less of a barrier in our communities? And how do hospitals better support access to T&I services in the community?
Okay.
The question comes from Jared Wilson.
Sure. I think that's a great question. So one of the things I think that is a big disservice right now, and there's some research, and the name of the person is not coming to mind at the moment, but a lot of hospitals and doctor's offices are using telephone lines to do interpreting. And the studies have suggested, in fact, that's actually creating a larger barrier. It is resolving a language barrier, but is creating a sense of not having a relationship with a person. And so for so many of us, the ability to talk about things that we're scared about or ashamed of, or, whatever about our bodies is predicated on having a relationship with someone, right? And so putting that machine in between, there's evidence that suggests that people don't refer to the interpreter on the other line as a person. They use words like la máquina, the machine. And I really wish I could remember whose study this is from, but I can't at the moment. So I think part of it is finding ways to ensure that our hospitals actually reflect the diversity of the society around us. Having people working there who can facilitate some of these conversations, whether that is, obviously ER is going to be ER, emergencies happen and we can't always schedule everyone, but I definitely think that there needs to be an opportunity to book a time for doctor's appointments and things when you know that there will be a live person there. And I think those people also can then, those language professionals can serve as information for the hospital to then say, okay, these are some gaps that I know because I'm involved with the community. And so these are some things that would benefit the community in ways that we can do it. And I think you first have to understand the needs of the community. There's not a one size fits all approach. But first you have to have the connection to the community. And I think that telephone line often cuts any potential local connection that you might have.
So both questions? Both questions?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's both of them.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, please.
So I heard that you said that you worked in a hospital, but then kind of stopped working in. What exactly do you do?
Say that a bit louder.
I think in the beginning when you said that you worked at a hospital, what did you do first?
Yeah, I was a medical interpreter. So I mean, I had previously done lots of literary studies and all of these things. So I was fluent in both languages, but I was not fluent in medical in the sense of I didn't know what different diseases were, right? So it was a lot of asking questions. Okay, what does that mean to the doctor as I, learn to navigate these situations?
So was it hard trying to, I guess, learn all of the jargon as you're trying to teach others about it as well?
So I did, yes. I mean, yes. I don't even know what some of these things are in any language, right? Body, I don't know where that X body part is or whatever, right? So there was a lot of pausing and saying, okay, I got to figure this out. But the reality is for, I think a lot of doctors, I would say there's a certain amount of types of issues that are very, very common. And then there are others that are much, much less common. So I think once you got that kind of core of, okay, I know what, I know this is what's likely to happen. I've seen this enough times, and I was a full-time interpreter, so it was like constant, right? You develop that pretty quickly, and then it is really the very infrequent things that you're like, oh, okay, let me go figure out what that is. And this was like before any kind of big databases and things were on too. God, I feel old. Sorry. Other questions online? Please.
Going off that, what are some practices that you recommend to someone pursuing or looking into a position as a medical interpreter?
Well, now, what I would suggest, like there's YouTube, which is crazy to think that there was like not some of these things. So I think now what you can do is you can actually go look at on-demand videos. I mean, it's as ridiculous and not fact-based as TV shows like ER or whatever are. The reality is that it gives you a quantity of words that you can slow down and figure out how you would interpret them. Now, I'm not saying don't expect that your work will be like ER or like whatever you find on YouTube, but part of it is learning to navigate a large enough corpus, a large enough collection of vocabulary. And now you have access to that in an on-demand way that I think is absolutely incredible. There are also specific training programs if it's something that you would want to do. There's a medical, there is an association that I can't remember off the top of my head, but that does also professional development stuff as well that you can do with them if you wanted to do specifically medical stuff. But also a big part of it, I would suggest, having not had this, is you can only interpret what you understand. So if you don't know very much about medicine, take an anatomy course or pick up some books and start to like learn to understand the concepts so that then when they come up, you know what you're looking for in the other language. I think there's one online as well.
Yes. Okay. Oh, Shidon Remy.
Oh, yes.
I think your model sounds fantastic, but as someone who has worked in T&I want to ask your opinion of institutional regulations. You want to rehumanize the language professional, but this is difficult. Interpreting agencies, in my experience, expect the one-to-one transfer of the message. They do not allow interpreter input and often see comments as overstepping one's bounds. Likewise, we are trained to maintain the medical professionals register without adjustments and without commenting that the patient is not understanding. Similarly, interpreters generally cannot walk away from a situation they are not comfortable with. They are expected to be ready for all situations and could lose their job for putting the company in an uncomfortable situation where they cannot serve their clients as originally promised. How can we move toward your model in the working world, overcoming all of these challenges?
That is a great question. And I think it really goes back to the last slide when I was talking about the need to raise capacity amongst the service providers. So for a lot of these, there are expectations that certain professions have a regular amount of professional development in an ongoing way every year, every 2 years, whatever it is. And I think that right now the relationship of a language professionals translating, interpreting is just imagined away. And you all did that as well, right? When we talked about it, it was kind of like, as long as it's the same. But yes, we can't work in a vacuum and we don't work in a vacuum. And so I think part of it is we need to also expect, both as language professionals, but also as a society, that there are severe inequities in the existing system and we need to collectively expect that. And some of that, I mean, legal interpreting is a whole other kettle of fish. That's a different conversation for a different day. But there are a lot of inequities. And I think that if we push whether you are going into medical field yourself and want to say, oh, have you worked, even if you're not a language professional, right? If you go into social work and encourage other people to get that base level of understanding of how to work and what they're seeking. I think that, you know, if they're seeking informed consent, they need to also understand how to get that when the language professional is in the middle. But I agree absolutely with Shaden that it is not an individual's problem. It cannot be one language professional against a whole bunch of people who think they know what they're doing and have no idea how language plays into this. It is not at an individual level that we can affect this change. It needs to be at a much wider societal expectation.
There's another question.
Please.
Have you had any experience as a medical interpreter in the veterinarian field?
I have not. No, I have never. My cat speaks Spanish.
Any other questions? Yes.
What do you think is the role of an interpreter in combating medical misinformation, especially as it relates to defensiveness and combativeness when the patient comes in?
Can you say a little bit more about the second part? So the question so far is, what is the role of the interpreter in combating misinformation? But I'm not sure I understand the last part.
Like, I've noticed that a lot of people get very defensive when their medical views are challenged. Like, if you've ever heard, like, the COVID-19 pandemic is a pretty good example. What do you think is really the role of the interpreter in trying to convey the doctor's information? And when it comes to, like, how do you physically present it? Are you being more combative or straight facts? Are you trying to relate it back to that?
Yeah, okay, so how then does the interpreter navigate that sort of potential for aggression or resistance or what have you? In that regard, I would say that this is an area in which the interpreter is not the expert. I think, you know, navigating the language in that regard is one thing, but the doctor is absolutely the expert on figuring out facts, and the doctor is also the expert on figuring out, you know, what treatments are available in a situation. Now, there are also bad doctors, but that aside, you know, I think that in that case, you know, the doctor needs to do the reasoning. And also be safe, always be safe. Don't put yourself in harm's way, right?
There is room for one more question, if you have it. Yeah, go ahead.
I know there's multiple ways of like methods of interpretation, and like what kind of way do you usually do in the medical profession? Would it be as the doctor speaks or as the patient speaks, or would you listen to a whole chunk of information then translate it into?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what you're referring to is the different models of interpreting. So there's consecutive interpreting, which is someone speaks and then the other person speaks when they've completed a piece. There's also simultaneous, which is at the same time, and there's like whisper interpreting. So whispering is like at the same time, but with you can't really do it for very long, trust me. You completely shoot your vocal cords. Did you have something to add to the question?
I always saw like when you speak over someone, like kind of at the same time when they're doing, like that's more like in business context. And like for the medical translation, you definitely listen to the person first and then you translate, like, am I right?
Yep. So also the speaking, the simultaneous is much easier when you have the proper equipment or the proper layout in which to do it. Because you are simultaneously processing information in your ear and saying it loud enough for someone else to hear it over the same person that you're listening to. So it's very easy for you to not be able to hear well, or then not to be able to hear you if you don't have the proper setup. So that can be geographic setup in a room, or that can be equipment. So yeah, in community settings, generally, what I'm talking about today would pretty much always be consecutive. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to the audience that were in Zoom. Thank you all so much for coming here and learn more about this wide, big topic that is still having many conversations ahead. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening. If you have any other question, please free to send it to my email, john.cruz@findlay.edu. And I will gladly send these questions to Dr. Attig if you have it and think about it. Thank you so much for coming here, and thank you so much.